Hi, Lindsay.
Well, happy first sexy Friday for March. Yes,
Yes, I'm excited. It's
it's
Instincts and
Instincts and
Subtypes
Subtypes
month.
Month. Yes, we're super excited to be back today. I just want to give a little bit disclaimer on myself. I've been really sick the last week or so I'm still kind of in the process of overcoming a cold. So if you see like a little bit of a red nose and I sound a little bit more deep, or if I cough a little bit, I got my peppermint tea in case I need it. But just wanted to give that so people kind of know sort of what's happening for me as well. But I know this is the second one and we introduced ourselves the last time, but we thought we would go in and just give you quick little introductions to who we are. So I'll go in and just talk a little bit about who I am, and then we'll have Sam come in and just share a little bit about who she is again as well. But we'll keep it short this time since you were with us last time, and so you know a little bit about who we are. So I am a licensed marriage and family therapist, as well as a certified sex therapist out of Minneapolis, Minnesota. I just got my IA accreditation last Friday, so now I'm also an IA accredited professional. So that's super exciting. And then one of the things I also forgot to mention is that I'm an adjunct faculty with Evolving Enneagram. And so I do some Enneagram coaching, as well as I'm going to be doing some intimacy courses. Some of you, or many of you, probably do know who Nian is, but I am super excited to kind of be bringing that all. So that's just a little bit about me. And I specialize in relationships and sexuality, utilizing the Enneagram. So how about you introduce yourself a little bit, Sam? Thank you, people who joined.
Okay. I am Sam E. Greenberg. I'm a sexuality researcher and an Enneagram and relationships coach. Well, an Enneagram coach specializing in sex and relationships. I did my Enneagram training with the narrative Enneagram. And I am a researcher and methodologist by training, but I'm also really interested in how we can apply the results of research to helping people, because I think, yes, I'm a 5, but I think just information without application is kind of useless. So I'm really interested in working with Lindsay and learning more about clinical work and clinical applications.
Oh yeah, I forgot to introduce. So I am a social 9 with the sexual instinct in the repressed position, which is really important today for our conversation. I think leads really well into sort of like, well, why this topic? Why this topic of the Enneagram and the instincts in its role sort of in sexuality? And I think one thing that's really huge that we talked a little bit about last time is that the instincts come in and they set the framework. And so this is a really big thing that none of us sort of expected to sort of see. So the instincts are going to be the thing that sets the framework, and your type comes in and creates the nuance. And so we will find that we're actually a little bit more similar to people that have the same instinctual background than we are sometimes of people of the type. And that was really, really huge in all the work that we're doing. And then we talked a little bit last time about sort of the Enneagram and Sexuality group and the collaboration of all of these 10 people, but just how huge sort of that has been in the work. And I intentionally, if you guys saw that little clip that I shared, I intentionally wore a bright shirt today because I am sexually instinct repressed. And part of what I'm trying to do is activate that sexual instinct in myself, and color, which we'll talk a little bit more about, is one of the ways that you can do that. But let's talk a little bit more about sort of examples that come into therapy. So when we talk about the different types of instincts, which I think is really huge, is like giving the example, and we're going to talk a little bit more about sort of the meaning that different types make around the sexuality. But like, one of the things that I would see come in with my practice is maybe I might get to self-preservation types. So let's just use that example. And a lot of like what society is sort of telling people around sexuality is that it should look and be a certain way. And I think I mentioned last time that a lot of the work that is done out there in the sexuality work is really done from the sexual instinct dominant perspective. And so sometimes people that are sexually instinct repressed, or they're self-preservation dominant or social dominant, they're not seeing themselves sort of within this work. And it's like a really good example of a couple that I had come into my office is they thought something was wrong in their sexual relationship because they were not having sex that frequently. And both of these people were self-preservation dominant. And I think one of my favorite stories once that they shared was like they're both laying on separate couches in different parts of the house. And they're like, hey, I'm kind of horny. How are you? Yeah, me too. Well, you know what? I'm really tired. And it seems like a lot of work to like come to where you are. And we'll talk a little bit more about that. But what was interesting is like they both felt desire and wanted and liked, yet no sexual behavior came out of that. And so I think it's really interesting. So when I have people come to my office, it's like a lot of times people are actually have really good relationships, but they think they should be having more sex. And instinct plays such a huge factor in sort of how this shows up. And so that's one of my favorite little stories I like to share kind of about a particular couple. I've had tons of self-preservation dominant couples come in where it's just like, well, we're not having sex that frequently and we're wondering if something's wrong with us. And I'm like, are you dissatisfied? Well, no, like we're fine with once every 3 months or once every 6 months. I'm like, there's not a problem then, you know? And so that ability to sort of bring that in about how this piece I think has been huge in my work to like bring into people like, it's okay if we don't have sex a lot. It's more about sexual satisfaction in the relationship. And then the other end of that, sometimes what I see come into my practice, and then Sam's going to go into the research aspects, is when we do have like sort of different stackings, right? Like, so we might have the person that's sexual instinct dominant and the person that's sexual instinct repressed. And sort of that conflict that'll come into play in sexual relationships sort of within that. Like, I want to be more desired. I want you to play with more sexual energy. And sort of one of the things I alluded to last time is sometimes the sexual instinct repressed person doesn't know what that means. And that can be really painful and difficult sort of for that sexual instinct dominant person too, when I just want to feel desired by you. And I just want you to play with the sexual energy. And the partner that sexual instinct repressed like really wants to give that to them, but they don't know what that means. And so I love how the Enneagram and the instinctual stacking has given me language for couples in my office to actually talk about this. Because now I can say, like, here's why this is happening. And a lot of my couples have found like a lot of like, just like, oh, okay, this makes sense now. I understand. There's not something wrong with me or something wrong with you. And then we work on sort of getting to that place of like, well, what is the good enough sexuality? And like, how do we get to a place to have the couple have more of what they want? So I just wanted to share some examples of like why this is so important from the clinical perspective. And then we're going to have Sam go into a little bit more about the research perspective.
I do have a follow-up question for you, which is, in the case you described, the sexual dominant and sexual repressed, which is something that I see a lot also in coaching, what do you do to help the sexual instinct repressed person like build that instinct? Because you talked about with yourself, and by the way, love your pink sweater. Wearing the colors, and I think it's funny, I'm wearing like an earthy color because that grounds me because I'm like too intense as a sexual dominant. So we're actually like dressing to support our balance, both of us. Yeah, so just give an example of what you would do to help the sexual
there's a
repressed person.
multitude of things. So one thing, you know, that I talked about last time was just, so if you go back and look at my reels, you're gonna see a color scheme going on there. Most of my clothing in those pictures is going to be neutral. And like one of the things you'll notice about people that have the sexual instinct in the repressed position is we do tend to wear neutral clothes. And now I say this, and you're going to go out in the world and you're like, oh my goodness, look at these people wearing neutral colored clothes. But it's very true. And so one of the things is that I talked about last time is the use of color, right? So putting on different brighter colors and seeing how that feels. I had said last time that this is something that actually Dace, one of our group members, had recommended for me to do, and I was like, I don't know how this is going to make a difference, right? Like, I'm like, you know, but it really does. It's like that ability to be like, wow, like how does it feel to sort of like be alive in the color of your clothing? And it was so interesting to me, something like so simple, like I feel really good when I wear this pink top. It's actually why I picked this particular top, which Dace actually helped me pick out. because I was like giving him clothes options, like that pink shirt, get the pink shirt. And it's very interesting how that feels. Another thing that often happens for people that are sexual instinct repressed is they're afraid to let go of control. So there's the idea of sort of like when I feel that sexual instinct energy in my body, and like I can actually feel it sometimes in my back, and I'm like, oh no, get back to where you belong, right? Like there's this wanting to like kind of put it back in its position. And it's like one of the things I've worked on too that can be huge is like putting music on and just moving your body to the way that you feel. It's like letting go and like dancing, right? And a lot of times it's by yourself because the sexual, repressed person's going to feel uncomfortable with like, I don't want to do this around other people, right? Because that means I'm going to let go of control. But it is a little bit of like letting go of control and like doing things that are kind of like outside of the comfort zone and being okay with that and sort of like allowing the energy to come up. Another way to do it is can be through meditation too. Sometimes when you're in the meditative states, I've had it for me, or I've recommended that for clients too, that like you'll start to kind of feel the energy kind of come up in your body and just like allowing it in the moment that you're meditating, and then being okay with like I can put it back after I'm done meditating, but like making a container spaced around sort of that ability to kind of experience that energy as well. And I think having a sexual instinct in the repressed position is so much more difficult than when you have social or self-preservation, when you have more concrete things you can look at to help people work on. And so I think it becomes very convoluted and confusing for people that have sexual instinct repressed, where it's like I can give concrete examples when I'm working with the other two.
Gotcha. That's super helpful. I was going to mention dancing as well. I have more questions, but I'll go into the research first and then we can just chat. So one of the reasons we want to do this topic and sort of March is the whole instincts and subtypes month for us is because what we mentioned last time, those of us who started looking into the sexual sex and the Enneagram topic, starting with type, we ended up realizing altogether that dominant instinct is sometimes even more important than type. And the funny story I mentioned last time, and here's an addendum to it, is when I first started doing this work, I was like looking at myself and other fives and nines. So I have a lot of nine friends, but I had a lot of self-preservation nines in my life, and sexual five is, I'm my own studying myself basically. And I was like, oh, nines and fives are so different. Like, this is such an interesting topic. I'm going to study it. And then much later, it turned out that the reason that nines and fives were so different was because I was looking at sexual fives and self-preservation nines. And self-preservation people are very different than sexual dominant people. Also, nines and fives are different. But right now, today, we're talking about dominant instinct. So I have the results of this exploratory analysis I mentioned last time that I'm doing on subtype that have just come in, and there's so much data, so I'm sharing it as of today. Whoever is attending, you're the first to hear it. So here's a couple of examples of what I found in the research of why dominant instinct / subtype is really important. So one of them is if we look at pornography use or sexually explicit materials use, you see 8s, 4s, 8s, and 7s as types that use more. And you're going to hear a theme, like 7s, 8s, and 4s, the top of a lot of things. Like, those are the types that tend to be, have higher desire or express higher desire. But when you dig in to the subtypes that are consuming sexually explicit materials more, guess what else shows up? Sexual 9s and social 5s and social 8s. So we have sexual 4, sexual 8, but then we also have social 8, social 5, and sexual 9. And this, like 9s, that's not really what we think of with 9s. And if you look at just the type, 9s are lower down because self-present social 9s are lower down with their consumption. So looking at it from a subtype lens, we get like a more full picture. So that's one data point I'm going to share. Hopefully I'm not planning too much. I have 2 more. BDSM use or kink BDSM behaviors. That's one, people are always really interested in that. Eights and fours, again, if you look at type, are the top most likely to have tried BDSM, and sevens are not too far behind. And that sort of like stands to reason in a way. But then again, when you break it down by subtype, you do have like your sexual 4, sexual 8, social 8, but you also have now your sexual 5 and your sexual 2. And Frederick's, if he's watching this, probably laughing somewhere because he always talked about sexual 5s. He found out are so kinky when he did his focus groups, and he was like, what? Why are they so kinky? But that was hidden in the data. Like, we look at type, we wouldn't see 5s because self-pres 5s, social 5s are way down, but sexual 5s are up there. So that's the second example. And then one more example, I want to look at it in a little bit of a different way, is overall sexual desire, dyadic sexual desire, which means desire to engage in partnered sexual behavior. Guess which 3 types are the highest? If you just look at type, 8, 7s, and 4s. And they're not the highest at everything, but like most things, 8, 7s, and 4s. But then another way to break this down is, does that pattern of 8, 7s, and 4s at the top hold true if we break it down by subtype? So if I'm looking at only sexual subtypes, but all 9, does it hold true that 8, 7s, and 4s are the highest desire of the sexual subtypes? Does this make sense so far? Okay.
Yeah.
So it turns out that yes, for sexual 8, sexual 7, sexual 4s do express the highest dyadic desire. When we look at self-pres, all the self-pres types, still true. Self-pres 8, self-pres 7, self-pres 4s of the self-pres express the highest desire. But when we look at social, then it's not true. It's only sort of true, because then we have, yes, 8s, but we have 5s and 2s again in the social. So we have social 8, social 5, social 2. So that, hopefully that wasn't too much. I can go on forever because there's like 26 different outcomes I measured, and I measured them all for type and subtype. So I'll release the data slowly so you don't get overwhelmed. But even in a research capacity, like drilling down into the details of subtype is really important to understand how sexuality is playing out.
I actually thought it was really interesting when you shared about the sexual 9s, but it also makes sense to me because as 9s, like, we don't share things unless you ask us. And so I think that there's sometimes this assumption about like that, oh, 9s don't consume, I don't have fantasies or don't consume materials and things like that. It's like, and it's like, well, we might, but did you ask us? And that's like one of the really huge things, I think, for 9s.
This research was anonymous. So that's like, I asked them and they didn't know their name.
I think is really fascinating, because in that sort of a format, the ones that are people are gonna be a little bit more introverted or a little bit more sort of like in the background, right? Like, you're gonna actually get them to I'll fill out surveys, but if you were to ask me point blank, I may or may not share with you what I think or feel, because I don't know you well enough, or you didn't ask the right questions. And so I think it's just really, I love how that survey was anonymous. I actually took it too, so so I'm one of your participants. But I think it's just very interesting how like it was anonymous, and I think it gives the opportunity for really all voices to be heard. Because I think like even as you say, like 8s, 4s, and 7s, like they often have the loudest voices, and some other types as well. But there's some types that were like more hidden, or we're not sharing unless asked, or we're more introverted. And so I just really appreciate sort of all the work that like you, Valerie, and Frederick have done around this to make sure that sort of everybody is being seen. I know that I said last time, but like what's been huge for me is like I really want everybody to be seen for who they are around their sexuality, right? And I think that you guys are really bringing that in a different way, which I think is really awesome.
Cool. So I think we're just going to chat now more about instincts and subtypes. I want to say one way that I use it for relationships, or helping people with their relationships, and sexuality, which I think is really helpful and important, is to look at stacking overlap. So it's you and your partner, if you can figure out your stacking and your partner's stacking. And stacking, if you don't know, is just your dominant, which one is second, and then which one is repressed. So that would be your stacking, 1, 2, 3. If you have a relationship, say, where your one partner is sexual dominant and self-pres repressed, and the other partner is self-pres dominant and sexual repressed, the only area of overlap before you start to work on your repressed instincts and balancing them, your only area of overlap would be social. And in that relationship, you find that the couple meets a lot in the social arena. So they may be hosting dinner parties, going out together, like doing community work, caring about status, caring about achievement, but both partners might feel a little bit unseen because we have the self-pres dominant and the sexual dominant, and both of those areas are not meeting in that. Same thing with sexuality. So if we talk about like the sexuality of a social dominant, which Lindsay, you know way more about than me, but their sexual relationship will be meeting more in a social sphere as well. So I think that can be really helpful framework for understanding like yourself.
Yeah, I think that is really interesting how you say that too. And I know that we both have done posts. I know that the Enneagram stacking stuff can be really hard to sort of understand or to comprehend. And so I know that can be confusing, but both Sam and I have done posts to sort of explain how that is. And I think it's really interesting too. Like I put a post out recently just about the meaning making that each, instinct makes around sexuality as well. And it's like when you say social, it's like sex is all about bonding and connection. And it's warmer and it's softer, and so it's a little bit different than, say, the other two and how they approach it. And so, like, it can feel sometimes to people, like with the social, it's like, it's just really nice and cozy and comfy, right? Maybe it's not as, as passionate as sort of like what the sexual instinct is looking for, that playing with that sexual energy. Like, I always think of it, like the sexual instinct is like hot, right? Like it's for them, the meaning of sex is all about desirability and sort of the playing with sexual energy, right? And then when you bring in the self-preservation or the preservers, it's all about sort of like the orgasm and the pleasure and the physicality around sexuality. It's like, well, think about that then with stacking and how that comes into play sort of in the sexual world. And I think another really interesting aspect that I wanted to bring up with that as well is that when we sort of have to tend to another person, so like in the situation where maybe somebody's a self-preservation dominant and their partner is a self-preservation repressed, right? And that tending to sort of that needing to take care of that repressed position in the relationship as well, and like how that in itself can really affect sexuality too. And in that one particular that I'm bringing up, where it's like someone's self-preservation dominant, the other person's self-preservation repressed, it becomes almost like a parent-child sort of dynamic. And like, well, then how does that affect sexuality? It's not very sexy if I have to take care of you, right? And so like that piece, I think, is also sort of huge for us to look at, sort of like that tending to. And I get resentful and I get frustrated because I don't feel like you're an equal partner in the relationship, sort of tending to this piece. It's interesting, in my own relationship, I'm social dominant, and my husband actually has the social and the repressed position, and that this is the area we have a lot of conflict around. Because I'm like, why do I have to be the one that's like checking in on people and seeing how they're doing? And when I'm sharing things that I'm struggling with sort of in the social realm, like, do I belong or do I have a position? He's like, who cares? Why does it matter? And I'm like, because it matters, right? And like even the navigation of sort of like the things that we like have in that dominant position, like are we supporting each other in the things that we need the most? And I think in that sort of sense, like he's not trying to dismiss me, it just isn't as important to him. And I see that dynamic sort of actually it happened today with a couple that I saw, where someone had the social and the repressed position and someone was social dominant, and sort of that navigation of that. So I just think it's really, really interesting. And I realize we're also like getting close to the end. This went really quickly today.
I have one thought, which might be like a nice, sexy note to end on, which is that exactly what you're saying, the reverse is true. So like when someone sees that their partner is taking on the work of their repressed instinct, especially if that repressed instinct is in the partner's dominant position, that's like a turn on. So if I'm self-preservation repressed, which I am, and I'm like cleaning the house and taking on responsibility for myself and doing good parenting, like that's going to be a turn on to my partner. So yes, it's like a turn off when you're not taking responsibility, but it's also
I completely
a turn on when you are.
agree. When my husband sort of takes control and like is, you know, navigating the social relationships, I'm like, yes. I'm like, you're so much sexier when you do that.
So I guess we'll just say we are hoping to do a audience topic for the April Sexy First Fridays. So please submit whatever aspect of sex and the Enneagram you're interested in, or Enneagram and relationships you're interested in, and we'll choose from your submitted topics for next month.
Yes, thank you so much for joining. We're really excited to continue to keep bringing this to you, and we, you know, feel free to personal message Samurai with any ideas that you have, because we really hope to bring in the things that you really want to hear. And so we look forward to next Sexy First Friday in April. Thank you for everyone that joined. We're so happy to have you here. Bye.
Bye, Lindsay.